We've got another fresh business problem for Rocketblock's experts to solve in today's mock interview. Today's case is a relatively straightforward growth question, but features some of the fastest case math I've ever seen. As a reminder, if you want to get faster at case math, you need to be practicing actively and deliberately. At the very least, pause this video each time a candidate gets asked a question, and when you're ready to build that skill for real, come to Rocketblocks to learn from our concepts and practice with our own drills. Good luck and have fun casing.
Your client, CityMD, is a regional urgent care chain operating about 100 sites in and around New York. They currently focus on in-person urgent care visits, with some imaging and diagnostics available and also some lab testing available. Despite a growing population and increased demand for accessible healthcare, CityMD's revenue growth has been flat over the past 2 to 3 years. They believe they are leaving money on the table with some new service offerings and methods to deliver patient care. The CEO has asked your team to explore how to reignite top-line growth.
Interesting. Okay. Tangentially was just doing a project that kind of overlapped with Medicaid and some of the healthcare field. So, hopefully I can bring some of that in. Sounds interesting. So if I can just kind of read back to you, make sure I didn't miss any points. Yeah. Sounds like, bottom line up front, CityMD wants to grow potentially via new service offering. So 100 sites, flat for the last few years, primarily in New York City geographically, primary focus on urgent care. It sounds like maybe some testing. Is that a pretty good idea of what they're doing?
You fully got it. Yep.
Excellent. Tessa, maybe I can ask a few questions. Anytime I hear flat growth, I immediately start thinking, is it the client themselves or is it the market? So, have they given us any kind of indication if it's the market and competitors facing this as well, or just CityMD right now?
Yeah, great question. The urgent care market in the US has actually been growing 5 to 7% annually, driven by demand for convenient, low-cost care versus ER visits. In New York, competition is intense with players like CVS Minute Clinic, Walgreens, Northwell, GoHealth, and independent chains, making differentiation through service mix and digital access critical.
Okay, interesting. So just us right now, never a good sign.
Yeah.
But means that could perhaps be turned around. Okay. You had also made a few points in the opening I want to touch on. There was a piece about services. It sounds like they're thinking about maybe offering some new services in order to kickstart this growth. Can you give me an idea of what services perhaps they offer now beyond just, the urgent care as well, but also, maybe what they're thinking about offering in the future? What's going through their mind at the moment?
Yeah, great. So in addition to the urgent care visits, they operate occupational health programs, which includes pre-employment physicals and drug testing. They have vaccination clinics and basic lab testing. These services are a small share of total revenue in comparison to the urgent care, but they are important for employer partnerships and for driving repeat patient traffic. And then you mentioned that they are considering some new service offerings, which was great. So they're actually exploring telehealth urgent care visits. There are some new reimbursement parity laws, which has recently opened, chronic care follow-ups and expanded diagnostics. And they're also considering deeper integration with digital tools such as online scheduling and patient portals to improve engagement and retention.
So interesting. I didn't want to show my hand too early. I was thinking telehealth from the beginning, and you had kind of mentioned that at the end of that first question. So it sounds like, maybe that'll be a theme. We can come back to it, but good to hear that's an idea they're thinking about. It's certainly post-COVID. One of the last questions I had is, are there any other service lines that they are running? Something maybe closer to primary care, but something outside of kind of like the urgent care you were referencing.
Yeah, so sorry, I may have misunderstood your earlier question. So that's the occupational health programs, vaccination,
okay,
basic lab testing. And then to go back to your question must have been about exactly what urgent care means earlier. So that's in lab testing, imaging, so x-rays, vaccinations. And the only other thing to mention there is they're open extended hours 7 days a week, which is a huge proposition. I know it always sucks when you start to feel sick or something on Friday night and you're like, oh no, this is going to be a horrible weekend. So
yeah, and certainly just trying to find time during the workday. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. This is huge. Certainly a lot of ideas that were swimming around in my mind came out in here. That's perfect. Tessa, can I have maybe a moment or two just to collect my thoughts and figure out how I want to approach this?
Please.
Excellent. Okay. I think I have kind of the way I want to approach this. I want to, at a macro level, approach it in two ways, kind of this idea of build or buy. So organic growth versus inorganic growth. And let's perhaps take the build piece first. And there's kind of three ways I'm thinking about it. One is more core expansion. So the physical piece. So thinking adding locations, extending hours, maybe even geographic coverage. It sounds like right now a lot in the New York City area, but perhaps there's getting out of New York City itself, maybe into the boroughs, maybe it's getting into Jersey as well. Also kind of in terms of the working hour piece, you had touched on this in the Q&A, but I know as a working professional, I just went to the dentist yesterday, it's really difficult to get there during the workday. So also the extended hours, I think could really open up your clientele, get them coming back more often. Whereas, I know for myself, I just kind of put it off until I can.
Yeah.
And this helps kind of like expand volume of customers from, a driver piece. I'm also thinking kind of second is service expansion. So more clinical. So can we add more complementary services? I know you had referenced some as well. There is sports, there is medicine, there is women's health. So can we get into something that's also very complementary to our current clientele? Again, I'm going to come back to myself, and I feel like I'm going to throw a lot of rocks into the healthcare piece here, but I hate having to go to different doctors for different things. So the more that my single doctor can do, the more I'm going to keep going back to them, especially if I can be going, after hours. This kind of expands revenue per visit for each customer. And then finally, the third piece here is more channel expansion. And this gets into the digital piece. Again, I know we hit on this. I think this is going to be huge post-COVID. There's just such a big demand for this, especially if I can do something via text or even just kind of low-touch digital. So it gets into more telemedicine. Maybe there's virtual triage. Maybe there's even mobile testing. Probably not the best example. I'm watching The Dropout right now on Hulu about Theranos. And, not a great example as a company, but what they were trying to do, I think, is just so impactful and important. So trying to get more towards that without the lying and deceit. And this kind of expands revenue. So, okay, so that's kind of like the build and organic side. Let's get into like the buy inorganic side. Perfect. And there's two ways, potential strategic partnerships and M&A. Before I dive into those, this is going to be probably more expensive, but also much quicker to market. You can go buy someone that already has this space, look for synergy. So let's take strategic partnerships first. Perhaps the idea of partnering kind of with someone up or downstream from you. I love the idea of Amazon's One Medical doing more of like primary care visits. Doesn't sound like we're doing a lot right there. So that could be a great synergy. And then also there's the M&A piece. Maybe we're merging with someone, maybe we're actually directly acquiring, but maybe it's local primary care groups, someone that also has a number of different locations, maybe someone who also has an existing digital presence as well that we can just hop onto. If I had to think about what my hypothesis is from the beginning, and I think some of what we've talked about has led me to this as well, is there's an over-reliance on physical visits and physical geography. So I think moving more towards some kind of hybrid mentality, being able to expand those virtual pieces is going to be important. But, we'll have to see if that is the case. So, I suppose in order to investigate that, I'd first like to look at CityMD's, maybe service offerings, the data that they have on that, which ones are driving and not driving growth in the future.
Great. Absolutely.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Ben's framework is a straightforward X or not X framework with organic growth and inorganic growth. But this accessible approach allows him to flex his creativity and business acumen with details throughout the approach. As Ben shares his ideas, he does well to put more emphasis on the pieces that he thought would move the needle or be more important to solving the case at hand. Ben does well to suggest the next step for where to begin the analysis.
So the analyst on your team has provided you with this exhibit, which will outline pretty much exactly what you asked for.
Okay, excellent. Give me just one moment. I'm just jotting down some notes right now.
Sure. Okay.
So kind of what I'm seeing, I'm going to talk you through what I'm seeing and maybe kind of the approach I want to take to, think about these in terms of a priority. So looks like projected patient growth by service offering in the US. It looks like we have the number of patients along our y-axis in millions, and then it looks like 5 different of these service offerings along our x. And what I want to do is think about this in 2 ways. Growth, but in 2 ways. 1 is percentage, and 2 in terms of absolute. If you work off a base of a low number, a percentage growth could be high, but the absolute number could be low. And I think we want a combination of each of those. So maybe I can just go one through another, and we'll kind of summarize it at the end. So let's take in-person urgent care. Not great. So it looks like, today versus 5 years from now, roughly 5 years from now, we're seeing a decrease of about 5 million patients. I mean, call that about 10 or 12% decline. Not good, but I imagine, given we're primarily urgent care for CityMD, this is the reason we've seen flat growth. I imagine, it's good that we've seen any kind of growth or, no change. Perhaps that's just coming from inflationary price increases. So not good, but hence the reason we're having issues. Let's jump to imaging diagnostic. Okay, good change. About probably 15 million patients there. Probably about 100% growth though. So huge percentage growth, but a low base that we're starting with. So, just comparing it across quickly, probably still going to get deprioritized, just given I see some larger jumps, but we'll come back to it. It's fast growing physical service. Lab testing, huge change. That's looking like about 25 million patients, probably roughly 80% growth. So that's incredible. And this has got to be one of our top priorities. I imagine something like lab testing, you could probably bundle with a lot of our in-person urgent care services, maybe post-urgent care. So I like the synergy potential there. Let's put it in the maybe pile for now, but high maybe. Occupational health employer services, probably about another 15 million patients, 75, 80% growth, pretty good. Again, not as high as the lab testing we just came to. I imagine this also might be a highly competitive area if we're competing with work services. I'm just thinking for my own company, if they have to compete against, 5, 6 other people, your margins probably get shrunk. But again, that's just anecdotal. Let's keep moving. Telehealth, virtual urgent care. This is massive, right? This is looking like about 45 million patients, probably 150 to 200% growth. Let's call it 180. And this is exactly what we were talking about earlier. So also that theme, try not to get locked into it, but it's largest growth. This has to be our clear front runner. So, coming out of this, in-person care is clearly declining. We need something else to put in place of that. We need to move towards more lab testing and virtual care. Virtual care being number one, but I think lab testing could be really synergistic with a lot of our existing in-person urgent care services as follow-up, especially the level of growth. Something that's not factored in here that I do want to call out, though, is the level of competition to break into these. I kind of touched on this with the occupational health kind of employer services. I imagine a lot of competition there. Telehealth, I know there's a lot of competition. I always see advertisements for mental health services, but I can imagine it's similar for other types of services. So I don't want to take away from that, but I suppose this is good. There's a lot of synergies here. I suppose what I want to think about next in terms of prioritizing telehealth and lab testing, do we have existing data on perhaps our current clients and how many of them might be looking for these types of services or the true synergies with our current clients and this?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Thank you for such a brief, comprehensive overview of that. And I really liked how you made such a clear distinction that we have fully diagnosed why CityMD is no longer doing well, and you've suggested 2 potential options for where to go next. So that was great.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Ben does a fantastic job of clearing the chart and introducing this exhibit into the context of the case. As he gets to the end of his analysis, Ben synthesizes all of his information and makes a very clear decision in terms of what his answer is for the actual case question. After each question or exhibit in the case, it's important for a candidate to update their main hypothesis or conclusion based on the new facts that they've seen. Ben does well to suggest where to go next.
In terms of your question, yes, we do have data. So we've been given the following data from the internal team at CityMD on their top 5 clinics, including average monthly visits, revenue per visit, and ancillary service penetration rates. The average revenue from a lab visit is $50 and an imaging visit is $100. Estimate the incremental monthly revenue that could be generated if Bronx and Queens clinics reached Midtown's labs and imaging penetration rates. Which clinic represents a larger revenue opportunity?
Oh, interesting. Okay. Just to read back, because I think might be a few of the numbers that aren't on here. So this is our top 5 clinics. Lab visits is $50 average revenue, whereas imaging visit is $100 average revenue. We want to know what is the incremental monthly revenue for Bronx and Queens if they meet the Midtown penetration. Do I got that right?
You got it. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. If you can give me like maybe 10, 20 seconds, I'm just going to map on my approach and maybe I can walk you through that before we dive in.
That would be great.
Okay. So Tess, I'm thinking about doing this in 3 primary steps, and there's definitely going to have to be some minor steps in between. So I'm thinking about, first calculating what's the current revenue per clinic. Second, what is the target revenue per clinic, given that Midtown benchmark? And then third, the incremental revenue. So what's the difference between each of those? And so if I can kind of break down at least the step 1 and 2, because I think it's going to follow very similar, is, I'm going to calculate the lab and imaging revenue separately. I'm going to do the number of visits times the current, lab or imaging percentage that you have on screen, and call it columns 4 and 5 here, and then multiplying by the revenue numbers you gave me. I'm going to do that for each one. The percentages will change for each, and then that's what I will subtract. And I'll have to do that for both Queens and the Bronx, and then maybe we can compare and contrast at the end. How does that sound?
That sounds perfect. Let's do it.
Excellent. Okay. So first step, I'm going to do Queens first, and then we'll get to the Bronx. So let's do current revenue first for Queens. So let's take lab. So lab, I'm seeing you have 4,600 for average monthly visits. And that is going to be multiplied by the 25% you have there, and then times the 50 revenue you gave me. So I'm going to break this down to pieces. 4,600 times 25%, that's basically multiplying by a fourth. So that gives me 1,150. I need to multiply that by 50. I'm just going to break this into 2 parts and multiply by 5 and then by 10. Just easier on paper. So times 5, that gives me 5,750. And then let's just tack on a 0. So that gives me 57,500. That is for lab current. Let's jump to imaging current. So still starting with the 4,600 again, because that's Queens. I'm going to multiply it by the 10% and then times 100. And so that is going to be 4,600 times 10%, just dropping a 0. That's 460. And then times the $100 in revenue, that's going to give me 46,000. So let's add those up. That's going to be 57.5 plus 46. And that is going to give me, it's going to be just a bit over 100, 103,500. Okay, so 103,500 is our Queens current revenue. Let's jump to Queens target revenue. Okay, so for lab, we still have the 4,600, and we're going to multiply that by, I think you gave me it, the 40% for visits, and then times the $50 in revenue. Okay. So 4,600, I'm going to break the 40% into 2 pieces again. I'm going to do times 10% and then times 4. So drop a 0. So 4,600 times 10% is just 460. And then multiplying that by 4, and that becomes 1,840. I'm going to do the same things for the $50 revenue. I'm going to multiply it by 5 and then by 10. So 1,840 times 5, that is going to give me 9,200. Then just add a 0 on to the final 10. So that's going to give me 92,000 for target lab revenue for Queens. Okay, let's do the same thing for imaging. All right, so we got 4,600, multiplying that by the 20% times 100. And so that is going to be 4,600, do times 10%, then times 2. So times 10% is 460. And then multiplying that by 2, it gives me the 920. And then times $100 in revenue, just tack on a few zeros, and that gives me 92,000 again. So that's just 92,000 times 2, which is great. It's going to be a little over 180, call it 184. Perfect. So 184 is the target Queens revenue. So what I need to do now is find the difference between the 184 and the 1035. So 184, and this is going to give me the incremental amount. So 184 subtract 1035. This is going to give me 80,500 for a monthly uplift for Queens. Okay, so that's the number I want to then compare with the Bronx side. So let me now calculate. All right, good. Sounds like you're getting the same thing.
Yeah.
All right, so let's calculate Bronx side now. We're going to follow the exact same process, so you can just hear me doing a lot of similar calculations. So step 1, let's do current Bronx revenue. Let's do lab and then imaging. So lab, we're going to do 3,200, given the number up on screen, times 15%, which is the percent for lab, and then times $50 in revenue. So 3,200 times 15%, I'm going to break that 15% into 10% and 5% and then combine them. So 3,200 times 10%, we're just dropping a 0. So that gives me 320. 3,200 times 5%, it's just half of the 320. So that gives me 160. So adding those two together is 480. And then times $50. Again, I'm just going to multiply it by 5 and then add a 0 on. So 480 times 5, and that is going to give me 2,400 times 10. So it adds a 0. So that's 24,000 for Bronx current lab revenue. Okay, let's jump to imaging. So 3,200 but this is going to be times 5% times $100 in revenue. So perfect. We already know the 3,200 times 5%. We did that above when we cut the 10% in half. So that gives me 160. So it's just 160 times 100, and that is going to be 16,000. Perfect. So again, just like we did last time, we need to add the 24,000 and the 16,000 up to get our total current Bronx revenue. So that is 24,000 plus 16,000, and that is going to give me 40,000. Okay. Now I need the Bronx target revenue, and then we'll subtract the two and see what the difference is. So this is given that kind of Midtown benchmark. Let's do lab first as per usual. So let's do 3,200, and that is going to be the 40% for lab times $50 in revenue. So just as per usual, 3,200, I'm going to break the 40% into two parts. Let's do 10% first. So just dropping a zero, that's 320 times 4 is then going to give me 1,280 or 1,280 times $50. Let's break it into two parts. So 1,280 times 5, that is going to be 6,400. Perfect. Just add a zero on for the final 10, and that is going to be 64,000. Okay. Let's do now imaging for target revenue for Bronx. So that is 3,200 times 20% times $100. Oh, interesting. So I'm seeing this side by side. The target revenue for lab, we did it times 40% and 50. Now we're doing it times 20% and 100. So, since we're moving each of those numbers in equivalent directions, it's actually going to give me the exact same thing. So both lab and imaging for target revenue for Bronx will each be 64,000. And so 64,000 times 2 is going to be our total. That's 128,000. So what we have is for current revenue for Bronx is 40,000. For target revenue for Bronx, it's 128,000. So I'm going to subtract those just like we did for Queens. And so that is 128, subtract 40. It's giving me 88,000. Okay, so just to recap, Bronx, we're seeing 88,000. Whereas Queens, we're seeing 80,500. So Bronx thus far has a larger incremental opportunity, but also, has a lower penetration. So I guess, looking back now, I suppose I probably should have seen some of that. So this kind of tells me two things. One, Bronx should likely be a higher priority for at least our expansion and ancillary services, kind of, what we've been looking at here. It's, 3x just by matching Midtown's penetration rate, which is incredible. How we get to that penetration rate is going to be another problem on its own. But Queens is still attractive. It probably shouldn't necessarily be ignored, but probably requires more pricing optimization, maybe more patient mix, some other solution. But I'd say coming out of this is prioritize both of them, but Bronx more so for what we're trying to do here. Given this information, I want to, see if CityMD should focus on, how to increase these services in these locations, or actually how to then implement this.
Fantastic. Wow. Take a breath there, Ben. I think we're going to need to submit this recording to the Guinness World Book of Records for the fastest math ever done. That was awesome.
Good.
As you look towards sort of the figures that you were given, I think that was super comprehensive in terms of the calculations that you did, and also super comprehensive in terms of the implications you've suggested here. But as you look back and think back to this question, do you think that it's realistic or reasonable that these two locations might be able to reach the Midtown location? And if not, could there be any reasons as to why that might be?
It's a great question. I certainly don't see why they couldn't reach the Midtown penetration rates. I'm not a big New York City guy, but I imagine that it's going to have a very similar demographic in terms of their income, as well as the people that's attracting. So that certainly helps. Barriers, though, I just see as competition. If the rest of our competition isn't impacted by this flat growth, and then I got to imagine everyone wants to enter the New York City market, again, because of the income and the demographic that's there, that it's not like we can just start trying to increase our penetration rate and our competition will do nothing. We have to think about what are the knock-on effects and what is a competitive reaction going to be. So yes, I think it's very doable, especially if we integrate some telehealth mechanism, but I fear the competitive reaction and how difficult it's going to be to sustain that over time.
Yeah, awesome.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Ben does a great job of clearly outlining what his equation is going to be for the math. Ben does well to explain his steps, including the mental shortcuts he's using to show his calculations along the way. Ben's calculations here are blazing fast. It's clear he's got a handle on the numbers and is able to quickly calculate through. Especially if you're looking at many calculations like this case, it's helpful to be rock solid in your percentage and multiplication calculations and how to use factoring to your advantage like Ben does here. While high-speed math is impressive, it's all in service of coming up with some new insight for the overall case. Ben does a great job to jump to implications after solving his math question and to connect the dots in the new number he's generated back to the overall question of the case.
You mentioned that was lab and imaging, but you had mentioned a few times that telehealth was really where your heart saw the potential here. So let's finally get there. New York State has actually just passed a law mandating reimbursement parity for telemedicine, meaning that insurers must now pay around the same amount, must now pay the same amount for a telehealth urgent care visit as they would for an in-person urgent care visit. Currently, as you know, CityMD does not offer any telehealth services and all visits are in person. Can you brainstorm the implications of this regulatory change on CityMD's growth strategy?
Oh, that's so interesting. Before I respond to that, my initial reaction is that could be good or bad because telehealth, I would imagine, has higher margins. But give me just a moment. I'm going to kind of think about how I want to structure this if I can take maybe 10 seconds.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So, I'm thinking about this in three ways. One, expanding service offerings. Two, maybe optimizing economics, the kind of financial piece. And then third, redesigning perhaps operations given this. So, perhaps the first one we can take is, expanding the offerings. And so from a service offering standpoint, I imagine this gives us more credence to add virtual urgent care, chronic condition check-ins. If we know that we can potentially get better margins, which is kind of what's going through my mind, it forces us to want to launch more of these hybrid offerings. Let's really take advantage of this if we can be charging our virtual sessions the same as our in-person sessions, which I would imagine have a lower overhead, so better margins, better cost. I imagine there's also a competitive positioning piece to this. Can we differentiate omni-channel provider such as ourselves now, hopefully, and do this differently, but also better? But I imagine as part of that, and I kept talking about the competition, we probably have to react quickly to this. I imagine if you're a CVS Health or some of those others that you would provide information about previously, they're either already doing this or they're going to be doing this quickly. So if we want to take advantage of this, in order to position ourselves, we probably have to act quickly. And so, that kind of moves me on to the optimizing economics piece, the more financial side. So first, I imagine, there's potentially an ability to renegotiate maybe a bundled rate with some of our customers and clients. So if you come in person and you also are open to doing a virtual session later, maybe we can get you a better rate altogether. There's also, a piece about patient acquisition that I probably don't want to ignore. So does this then give us the ability to extend our reach and the zip codes of people that we're offering this to? Initially, one of my ideas up front was trying to expand to more places outside of New York City, maybe in New Jersey. Does this allow us to then reach them without having to expand our actual footprint and the infrastructure we put down? So a cheaper way to expand those offerings and build kind of a stronger patient relationship. I imagine there's also a piece of that we can use it as a top of funnel. If I'm living in New Jersey and going to New York maybe a couple times a month, can I first engage with them virtually, but then start going in person as I'm going into the city? And then finally, there's a piece that I want to touch on about kind of redesigning our internal operations. So how do we actually make this a reality? So we probably need to think about scheduling flexibility internally, probably reallocating some of our providers or people so they're not just all in person at these centers, but maybe they're at home engaging with people virtually. Maybe we need to adjust our clinic workflows, managing different mixes of virtual and in-person. So I think internally, we're going to have to think about how CityMD flexes its people and its time in order to actually make this possible. So telehealth parity certainly increases those potential margins. But again, I think we need to think about our internal operations and also get to this quicker than our competition perhaps can react.
Fantastic. That's really, really good.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. Ben deploys an advanced tactic here in which he shares his first reaction to the question from Tessa, but then takes a second to come up with a more detailed response. You can apply this tactic in your initial framework or on any subsequent brainstorm questions throughout a case. Ben's structured brainstorming is not an academic exercise. As he's talking through the implications and sharing ideas, he's building momentum towards a clear conclusion. A common mistake for candidates is to list out all the pros and cons of different ideas in a way that sounds smart. But when it's time to make a decision, they get gun shy.
So the one other risk that the CFO of CityMD is worried about is that telehealth services will cannibalize higher margin in-person services. Their team has provided some assumptions that they have made about the monthly profit impact. If 10% of visits across the Queens and Bronx locations shift from in-person to telehealth, and I think you know most of this, but just to remind you, the average in-person visit is $160 in revenue, and it's $136 in costs. Whereas a telehealth visit is the same $160 in revenue thanks to the new legislation, and it'll be $96 in costs. So I think you had hypothesized about that, and you were correct. Quantify the net monthly profit impact of this shift. Do you still recommend that CityMD prioritize telehealth?
Oh, interesting. So glad to hear some of my hypotheses coming through. I didn't even think about cannibalization. That's a really good example. I was thinking about expanding customer bases, not potentially, cannibalizing the same ones. Okay, so sounds like 10% of visits are shifting to telehealth. The in-person margin is going to be about $24 versus telehealth is going to be about $64. So better margin, that's great. But we want to understand what's the monthly profit impact and, does this change our perspective at all? So think about doing this in probably 3 ways as well. Let's calculate what the total visits are. It's going to be very quick. Maybe we can break the amount that's shifting into cannibalized and non-cannibalized, and then let's calculate the profit. So let's take it one step at a time. I think I'm going to have a question or two here for you. So total visits, I'm just looking back at my numbers. Queens was 4,600 visits per month. Bronx was 3,200. Cool. That gives me 7,800 visits per month. And you had said 10% shift. So that's going to give me 780 televisits per month is our world right now. That's what we're working with. Okay. Second piece, cannibalized, non-cannibalized. I didn't see what percentage or how many people or, how many customers are being cannibalized of that 780. Perhaps we can take a high side and see what the extreme impact would be. Is it okay if I take like an 80% cannibalized and see just how extreme that could look and if it's still a good idea?
That's great. Let's do it.
Okay. So let's take the 80% cannibalized. That means 20% are our net new demand. So 80% of the 780, that's going to give me 624 visits cannibalized. And that means the remaining 156 are the incremental visits. Okay. Step 3, let's calculate this all over again. I'm getting PTSD from our last math. Okay, so profit from cannibalized visits. Let's do telehealth and then in-person, and let's calculate the incremental. So telehealth profit per visit, I know we would do this 64, in-person was 24. That was the 160 and 136 and 160 and 96. So that is going to give me $40 difference, the 64 and 24. And I want to do the 624 cannibalized visits in person every month times that $40. Give me one moment. I'm just going to brute force this one. That is going to, gosh, just under 25. It's about 24,960 is what I'm seeing. And so then I also want to, that was profit from cannibalized visits to the 24,960. I then want to calculate the profit from net new demand, and that's going to be the 156 visits times $64 telehealth profit. And that is going to be much less. God, just under 10K. It'd be nice if it came out to round numbers. That's going to be 9,984. Okay. And so total incremental profit, if I'm adding the 24,960 together and the 9,984, that is going to be, it's going to be 34,944. Okay, so just under $35,000 per month. And we took a very extreme 80% cannibalization number. And even seeing that, telehealth still raises the profit given that much higher margin of the 64 versus 24 for in-person. So it can free capacity, it can give us better margin. It can also potentially even add expansion of new clients and patients, which is great. So, even taking this 80% extreme example, I see this as a huge win, which is good to see. So, even with the cannibalization, still seeing this as a positive.
Awesome. Sounds great.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. When you're missing a piece of information, as is the case here, it's always best to try to make a hypothesis or come up with an assumption to drive the interview forward. It's much stronger to go to the interviewer with a suggestion than to simply ask a question looking for key insights. Once again, Ben finishes his calculations and he's adding this new information into the overall context of the case, using it to help make a decision for the main case question.
Okay, if you were presenting to CityMD CEO tomorrow, what would be your recommendation to reignite top-line growth?
Absolutely. Give me just one moment. Okay. So the goal of our case was how CityMD should reignite growth in the top line over the next several years, given flat revenue. And the recommendation should be to launch a telehealth-enabled hybrid care model, something to expand both patient access, increase margins, and actually capture a faster growth into the future. Telehealth market is projected to grow about 180 to 200% by 2030 in the next 5 years, versus if we stay in just urgent care right now, we're looking at a decline in customers. Even if 80% of telehealth visits are then cannibalized, profitability still rises by about $35,000 per month. Just looking at the Bronx and Queens, if they were looking at that against the Midtown location. So this looks like a fantastic opportunity to raise our margins and also take advantage of growth. There are risks though. So one of the main risks I flagged is probably operational disruption or patient leakage. So during the transition, if we're not doing a good job of transitioning our patients over, they might leak into higher competition in the area. So we really need to make sure telehealth is integrated seamlessly. What I would do in terms of mitigation is probably pilot a hybrid model in the Bronx and Queens, maybe do a phased rollout, slowly test this out and track whether patients are slipping through or we're actually able to capture these synergies that we've identified. As a next step, we would love to help CityMD design and execute this telehealth pilot and help you as you try and ramp up the growth over the next few years to capture this opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben. It was great to case with you today.
Thank you, Tessa. Appreciate it.
Here's some feedback from Tessa. After 30 minutes of case conversation, Ben does well to start his conclusion with a client goal. This goal-oriented approach has been present throughout the case, so to restate the goal explicitly here in the conclusion feels like a crisp, natural way to conclude the case.
Hey everyone, it's Kenton Kavesky here, the founder of Rocket Blocks. Thank you so much for watching this mock interview video. I hope you found it informative and helpful as you are getting ready to prepare for your own interviews and hopefully landing that job offer you are excited about. We have a ton of great content on the Rocket Blocks channel coming out on a weekly basis, mock interviews, mini lessons, and chats with our Rocket Blocks experts. So if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so. There is a big red button below. And if you hit that, you'll get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.